Has anyone here ever been diagnosed with Marthaplexy? It's a condition that develops when one feels overworked and underpaid and misunderstood. It happens when we lose balance in our lives. It happens when we are so busy that we are not present to what's most important. Jesus saw this in Martha in today's gospel. Her life was simply out of balance. She was distracted from what was most important, distracted by all of her rushing around. There's a wonderful German film that, interestingly enough, is entitled Mostly Martha. In this film, Martha is the renowned totalitarian chef at a very ritzy restaurant. And everything for Martha is centered around food. Food fills her life, allowing for nothing else. No friends, no relationships, no hobbies. It's only when her sister passes away, leaving her 8-year-old daughter in Martha's care, that Martha loses control. And losing control for Martha is something that she certainly has never, ever been comfortable with. She's a workaholic and a perfectionist. She creates master recipes, but she can't take the measure of her own heart. This inner drive that keeps her at the top of her game also is sealing her off from life. She's rigid and unforgiving. When customers at her restaurant complain about the food not being to their liking, she storms out of the kitchen and she yells at them for their Philistinism. You see, in her world, there is no middle ground. You either get it or you don't. The film, Mostly Martha, it's a wonderful character study about a woman who learns that a little letting go of control is not always a bad thing. So what about us? How many of us could be diagnosed with Marthaplexy? How many of us are out of balance, control freaks? It's all black and white. There's no gray. How many of us find ourselves sealed off from life and unable to even take the measure of our own hearts because of the schedules that we keep, the demands we place upon ourselves and our loved ones, the pressures we put upon ourselves to succeed, to perform, to make money, to have more and more, to be at the top? In today's gospel, Martha was rushing around fixing and preparing, and as that brilliant gospel text says, distracted with all the serving. The great spiritual writer Richard Rohr writes about Martha, and he says she is one where everything is good and right, but the one thing she was not present. And then he goes on to say something very interesting. He says, "This is the kind of goodness that does no good." Very interesting phrase, the kind of goodness that does no good. So perhaps Jesus' challenge for us today, in a world that's gone crazy with busyness and chaos, is not that we have to become total contemplatives, but that we must deal with the tension in our lives between running around on the one hand and coming to rest on the other in order to make sense out of our running around. There's a wonderful female scripture scholar who has a very interesting take on this particular passage in the gospel. And she sees it as the tension between making a living and making sense out of our living. She sees Jesus challenging Martha in this way: what's the better? Preparing a fussy meal with so many dishes that you are too exhausted and too short of time to be hospitable, or preparing a simple meal with just one good dish of baked beans or pasta so that you have time to be out there with your guests. So, at the end of the day, what is better? A fussed up life or a simple life? What's better? A complicated life or a life you try to keep as simple as possible in a very complicated world? In that gospel today, Jesus was willing to challenge and upset his host. And I'm sure that if Jesus was with us today, he would be more than willing to challenge us and upset us. He would probably tell us that we are living in an insane world and that we are out of balance. We've lost our balance. He might cite how we speed to work while on our phones, drinking our coffee, answering our emails, and texting our friends. He might point out that we are on too many committees, go to too many meetings, and seldom get enough sleep. He might tell us that we have the best food ever, but seldom take the time to truly taste and relish the goodness of it. He might tell us that we drink way too much coffee to wake up and take way too many pills to go to sleep. So I believe the challenge of the gospel this weekend is not that we are called to leave the world for the monastery, but that we're called to deal with the tension of too much busyness and not enough presence. Going back to Richard Rohr, that spiritual writer whose new book is entitled The Naked Now, he makes a very interesting statement. He says, all great spirituality is somehow about letting go. And that's what Jesus challenges Martha to in that gospel, to let go of her busyness and simply be. To let go of controlling everything and allow life to be simpler. And that's the challenge for all of us. And if we don't struggle with that tension, we end up like Martha in the movie, sealed off from life and unable to take the measure of our own hearts. That great novel, The Plague, written by Camus, there's a great scene at the end of that where the two characters are frazzled from spending days and nights fighting the plague, running around serving one dying victim after another. And so they decide to take 1 hour off for friendship. And they begin to share the stories of their lives with each other. And they take a brief swim in the ocean. And one of the characters says this to the other. He says, "Of course we must care for the victims, but if we don't take time out for friendship, we will forget why we are fighting the plague in the first place." They were taking responsibility for that share of the frazzle which was theirs, and they found the time to take a refreshing swim in the ocean. And that, in a very convoluted way, was contemplation for both of these people. In the gospel this weekend, Jesus wants Martha to take responsibility for her share of the frazzle inside of her and find time to refresh and replenish herself with Mary. So what about us? Is there any sense to the living that we are making? How do we deal with the tension in our lives between running around on one hand and coming to rest on the other so that we can make sense out of our running around? How many of us are so frazzled that we are actually sealed off from life and unable to take the measure of our own hearts? How many of us could be diagnosed with Marthaplexy?